In this video, I'm going to discuss the accessibility portion of the ComSOP, which is section 15, and we are going to be looking at the minimum number of parking spaces that are necessary for accessibility. We're going to count how many parking spaces that we will need, and also what the measurement requirements are going to be for those accessible parking spaces. So we're going to talk about the parking section of the ComSOP, and we're going to discuss 1.1 through 1.5. Right now in 1.1, it is important for us to understand the necessary minimum accessible parking spaces that are available. So in this parking lot here, I've got about 30 to 35 parking spaces. So it is a requirement for us to have at least 2 accessible parking spots, which is what we have. In the ComSOP, it states that a parking space that is accessible has to be at least 8 feet wide, and there has to be at least an aisle next to it that's clearly marked as this, that is 5 feet wide. Let's do a quick measurement to make sure that we're in compliance here in this parking space. I have 8 feet here in this parking stall, and already looking at it, I know this is going to be more than 8 feet. Which this one is at 9 feet, so this over exceeds the 5-foot limit. But the reason that it does is because this is actually a van accessible parking space, which we'll discuss in section 1.2. Section 1.2 is going to reference van accessible parking spaces. Now it's important to understand, per the ComSOP, even if you have one accessible parking space or multiple, you have to have at least one of those accessible spaces be van accessible. So, for example, if this was our only stall, it should be van accessible. However, as I mentioned before, this parking lot is about 35 spaces, so I have 2 accessible spaces, which is the requirement for this parking lot. What we want to make sure of with van accessible parking spaces is the aisle and the parking space itself combined is at least 16 feet. So I'm going to measure real quick and make sure that we are measuring correctly. Right now, I have this space at around 18 feet, almost to the end of that. So I have exceeded that requirement, knowing that this parking space is in fact accessible, and it is going to pass the requirement for van accessibility. Section 1.3 is going to describe the necessary parking space that will have a van accessible sign. Now the sign has to have the international symbol of accessibility. You can see here in the parking spot in front of me, that's what that symbol is. However, per the ComSOP, we have to have that symbol on a sign. So for example, behind me, this van accessible parking space has a sign, and also at the bottom, it has the word van accessible. So we know that this sign is going to be with this space, and it is proper for the ComSOP. However, this space right here does not have a sign. So this would be listed as a defect in my report, telling them that they need to have a sign present, because if this ever washes away or it becomes damaged in the parking lot, patrons at least need to know where to park based on that sign's presence. 1.4 is going to describe the accessible parking spaces and where they are going to be located closest to the entrance. So what we want to determine is, one, where is going to be my main access perhaps. So I've already done the exterior inspection on this building and I have determined that this is my main access. So my accessible parking spaces have to be the spaces that are the closest to the main accessible entrance of the building. 1.5 is going to describe where my accessible route is in conjunction with my accessible parking spaces. So for example, here I have my aisle that we've already measured. We know it's adequate, and this aisle is unobstructed all the way up to the entrance that we've identified as the main accessible entrance of the property, leaving this to be the proper route for anybody utilizing this parking space. So we have just fully understood section 1.1 through 1.5 of the ComSOP parking, accessible parking spaces. So a quick review, we want to make sure that we have the proper number of accessible parking spaces per the overall number of parking spaces here on the property. We want to make sure that our accessible parking spaces are the proper width, and we have the proper accessible spaces. For example, that we always have a van accessible space that's present with the proper signage. Lastly, we want to make sure that we have the aisle in the middle of the parking space or next to it is the unobstructed path or route that is going up to the entrance that we have deemed the most accessible entrance of the exterior of the building. Now, we've already noted here on this inspection that we're missing a sign here for this parking space, so that would be something that I would place in my report. Other things that I often will find in parking spaces similar to this is missing signs, damage that's going to be in the accessible aisle. So maybe there's cracking or separation that could cause a trip hazard, foliage or anything, blocking possible signage, or in general, faded striping or lining in the parking lot where people don't fully understand that's where you should park, or if that's even an accessible route at all. All of these things should be documented inside of your report in your accessibility section or your standalone accessibility report.